In the January 1969 issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, Henry Kissinger wrote an essay about why the peace talks he had secretly helped sabotage the year earlier had failed. In Kissinger's estimation, they hadn't failed because they had been sabotaged, as some people had alleged. Rather, they had failed because they weren't being led by people with the right tactical acumen, aka people like Henry Kissinger. The strategy Kissinger then lays out for success is nuanced, intelligent, and critically treats all the Vietnamese players as intelligent, sophisticated political actors. And 1 month after he wrote this, Kissinger became the National Security Advisor, and he successfully implemented almost none of it. In fact, reading it in hindsight, Kissinger lays out the case that Vietnam was unwinnable so meticulously, you wonder how he thought his plan would overcome the obstacles. But the essay also contains the answer to that question. He was convinced losing the war would be so catastrophic that any Hail Mary strategy was justified, or as he puts it, however fashionable it is to ridicule the terms credibility or prestige, they are not empty phrases. Other nations can dear their actions to ours only if they can count on our steadiness. The collapse of the American effort in Vietnam would not mollify many critics. Most of them would simply add the charge of unreliability to the accusation of bad judgment. You can see here the seedbed of almost every stupid foreign policy decision in recent American history. Credibility, aka saving face, or as it's known in international relations theory, prestige. Kissinger is usually accused of being a realist, but his use of this concept, prestige, is a major deviation from the traditional realist theorists like Hans Morgenthau.
I think the major problem which we are facing is that the administration has not been able to make up its mind about what it wants. Does it want a self-determination for South Vietnam at the risk of a communist takeover? Or does it want to stop communism at any price, even at the price of self-determination? You can't have it both ways.
In his book Politics Among Nations, Morgenthau made a distinction between a country's power and everyone else's perception of that country's power, which he called prestige. In Morgenthau's theory, a country should try to manage its reputation in such a way that its prestige matched its power. An imbalance between the two would, in Morgenthau's theory, lead to war, since a country that was stronger than it appeared would invite other countries to attack it. And if a country was weaker than it appeared, other countries would be needlessly scared of it and might form alliances to defeat it. But in Kissinger's theory, prestige was power. The more prestige a country had, the less willing its allies would be to break with it. And if a country did break its alliance with the superpower, that would make the superpower appear even weaker, which could set off a chain reaction in which more and more allies fled. The conclusion of this theory of geopolitics, then, is a sort of domino theory completely unmoored by any geography. All real geostrategic considerations, all economic considerations, all context and nuance is just reduced to a single scalar variable called credibility. So you have to bomb Cambodia to prevent Soviet tanks from rolling through the Fulda Gap, or you have to overthrow a socialist government in Chile in order to prevent a communist government in Italy, or you have to do a genocide in Timor-Leste in order to, protect Japan. In this theory, fighting war becomes not a means to an end, but an end in itself. You kill to prove you're willing to kill, because reputation is everything. This is not a video about what Henry Kissinger is accused of doing in office. In fact, I'm kind of assuming you already know all that. Rather, this is a video about Kissinger's reputation. How did he come to be so controversial, as the media likes to delicately put it? Because it isn't a result of what he did. For example, under Nixon and Kissinger, the United States expanded the Vietnam War, organized the secret bombing campaign of Cambodia, overthrew the Chilean government, and gave the green light to the Indonesian and Pakistani governments to commit genocide. But none of this was secret.
As you see here, they have moved into Cambodia and are encircling the capital.
Even the secret bombing campaign of Cambodia only stayed secret for about a month, and the coup that overthrew Chilean President Salvador Allende happened in the middle of a Senate investigation into whether or not the CIA was trying to overthrow Salvador Allende.
You told him that you were prepared to put up the $1 million in support of a government plan for the purpose of bringing about a coalition of the opposition to Allende.
That's correct, Mr. Senator.
Which, probably simplified things.
The testimony here said it was to to continue democracy in Chile.
Yeah. Mr. Dean, democracy, as I understand the term, is the right of the people to determine their government by vote.
In spite of all this, Kissinger's reputation in the 70s was sterling, because these were all seen as Nixon's crimes. As President Nixon got more and more mired in Watergate, shuttle diplomacy didn't just bolster Kissinger's reputation as a diplomat, it also kept him away from the press when they had the most questions about Watergate. Combine that with Kissinger's constant flattery of the press, and Kissinger increasingly came to be seen as the grown-up in the room. People were desperate in the Watergate era to find an island of stability, and Kissinger, as a nerdy Harvard technocrat, seemed to project that stability.
When you have a foreign policy that works, and the man who implements the foreign policy that the president decides does a good job, you don't bench that player.
But that luster started to fade in the 70s. It started with Gerald Ford's re-election campaign. That year, Ford was facing challenges from both the left in the form of Jimmy Carter and from the right in the form of Ronald Reagan. Both attacked Kissinger relentlessly. For Carter, it was a way to connect Ford back to the crimes of Nixon.
Now, we've been hurt in recent years in this country. In the aftermath of Vietnam, Cambodia, Chile, Pakistan, Angola, Watergate, CIA, our people feel that we've lost something precious. That's not necessary.
For Reagan, it was a way to distance his personal ideology, namely swivel-eyed, paranoid anti-communism, from the disaster that had been the Vietnam War, a war caused by paranoid, swivel-eyed anti-communism.
Now we must ask if someone is giving away our own freedom. Dr. Kissinger is quoted as saying that he thinks of the United States as Athens and the Soviet Union as Sparta. The day of the U.S. is past, and today is the day of the Soviet Union. And he added, my job as Secretary of State is to negotiate the most acceptable second-best position available.
That was followed by a series of exposés about how the supposedly stable, moderate Kissinger had in fact spent his years in the White House amassing power by encouraging and enabling the president's worst impulses. In 1979, the book Sideshow by William Shawcross showed how the Nixon administration destroyed Cambodia as a side effect of its strategy to win Vietnam, and ended up setting the stage for the Khmer Rouge, and how Kissinger played a starring role as Nixon's hatchet man for getting around the government bureaucracy.
True records of the B-52 missions were burned in incinerators in South Vietnam, and false statistics were inserted into the Pentagon's own top-secret computers. This is rather terrifying because the B-52 planes are, after all, a part of Strategic Air Command, a part of the nuclear defense of the West, and here were their records being corrupted in a rather awful way.
This is what cemented his name with the bombing of Cambodia. Then in 1982, Seymour Hersh released his book, The Price of Power, a book that, among other things, revealed Kissinger had helped Nixon sabotage the peace talks to end the Vietnam War in 1968, possibly extending the war for another 7 years, and implying that Kissinger only got his job as National Security Advisor not because he was the best fit, but because by participating in that scheme, Kissinger had awarded himself blackmail material over the president.
My experience has shown me that Henry Kissinger is ultimately a toady, and I think he's a very safe appointment. He's going to give you what you want.
The titular price of power was, of course, everyone who had died in Indochina after 1968. Most of Hersh's accusations were then substantiated in 1992 by a writer named Walter Isaacson. Whereas Hersh was a left-wing muckraker, Isaacson was an establishment guy through and through, who would go on to specialize in flattering biographies of geniuses. And he clearly wanted Kissinger to like him, but instead of lying for him, Isaacson just tried to put a positive gloss on the truth of what Kissinger had done. But that gloss just made Kissinger seem all the more insane.
If I may say so, I think if he read it carefully, and if he weren't quite so thin-skinned, and he certainly admits to being thin-skinned, I mean, he's notoriously so and jokes about it, he would realize that the book is, on balance, favorable to much of his foreign policy.
The book was a huge hit. They even made a movie based on it starring Beau Bridges and Ron Silver, and it was not subtle.
My Jew boy, Haldeman, where the hell's my Jew boy? Gone!
The hippies, the Jewish liberals. Tell me, Henry, why are all Jews leftists?
Walter Isaacson's book also had one other effect. When it released, the London Review of Books chose an up-and-coming British-American columnist named Christopher Hitchens to review it.
Probably a lot of you are old enough to remember times when it's been told to you as voters and taxpayers that some atrocious course of action is necessary in some obscure corner of the world in order that face not be lost, or in order that face be saved. I have to ask you again to consider how many of you would agree to have somebody bombed or tortured or murdered or disappeared or assassinated to save this face.
Hitchens came away from the book believing Kissinger was a sociopath, and that Isaacson was too much of a genteel insider to say what needed to be said.
Walter Isaacson is one of the best magazine journalists in America, but he moves in a world where the worst that is often said of some near-genocidal policy is that it sends the wrong signal. He accordingly approaches the problem of evil with some circumspection. It became very plain to me, as I finished the book, that if I were to employ the argot of popular psychology, I could say that I had been reading the profile of a serial murderer.
So he began writing his own book. The Trial of Henry Kissinger is a sort of prosecutor's brief against Kissinger. Not a history or a biography, but an elaboration of the things he did in office and why they were not just bad, but literal crimes. This book represents a sort of culmination of all the other exposés that had been published in the previous 20 years, and it created a sort of canon of facts about why Kissinger was evil. But Hitchens' book was also tapping into a bigger debate that would have gone on with or without Kissinger.
British police took General Augusto Pinochet into custody more than 6 weeks ago. Great Britain was one of the few countries that would grant the former Chilean dictator a visa.
A feeling had started to spread through the 1990s. Americans were reassessing the way they had behaved during the Cold War. With the Soviet Union's core weakness laid bare, suddenly all of those coups and wars seemed especially pointless. And many of the architects of the Vietnam War in particular started releasing mea culpas of one form or another. But rather than join in, Kissinger seemed to want to use this opportunity to play the heel.
Well, you know, this is the year of apologies.
Yes.
And of self-flagellation.
On top of that, many of the dictators whose power rested on their usefulness in the Cold War suddenly found themselves no longer of use, and increasingly they were put on trial. In multiple countries, Henry Kissinger was being called as a witness. Though he himself had never been charged with anything, Kissinger had to start checking in with a lawyer before he did international travel, in case he had to worry about being subpoenaed. International law was finally gaining the teeth of enforcement. Rather than the normal law of the jungle, the world seemed to be developing a real international order, built on the rule of law and human rights. But of course, for that to be true, it would be important for the United States to not be above that international law. Hitchens' real argument was that in order to preserve this system, America would need to make a sort of sacrifice, or the hypocrisy would discredit the whole system.
Does the United States not go around the world insisting on the speedy delivery of other war criminals to instant justice? Aren't we indeed delighted to see that Mr. Milosevic was finally collared today? I certainly am. But we do not talk to our own society in the language, the peremptory terms we quite rightly employ with Serbian fascists.
And who could be a more compelling sacrifice than Henry Kissinger, who, when everyone else involved in the Vietnam War was either dead, dodging the spotlight, or giving mea culpas, was living the high life, hanging out with celebrities and trading deep thoughts with Charlie Rose on television, unrepentant.
If I had to do it over again, I would do again substantially the same way, which may make me unreconstructed.
Did this government, the government that you served, other Western governments bear some responsibility for Pol Pot coming to power and having the opportunity?
Well, you know...
And with some bitterness, he also blames the anti-war movement, the establishment, and the media, never himself, for the way the war ended.
The secret bombing of Cambodia. Do you regret this today?
No.
After what happened in Cambodia?
But what happened in Cambodia? And it takes a really circuitous reasoning to say that those who try to resist the Khmer Rouge taking over are responsible for the Khmer Rouge taking over. That's like saying the people who bombed Hitler are responsible for the genocide. Are you asking me whether I would change anything that I had done?
Yeah, I think feel sorry for anything.
My God, you're asking the wrong person. Now, let me tell you, I get asked that question often, and I would love to have an answer where I could say, if I only had done this one thing differently, then everyone would think I'm very open-minded. But the fact is, on the main lines of our policy, I wouldn't change anything. I'd try to do the best we could.
But it didn't happen. Apparently no one in the State Department thought there was anything wrong with what Kissinger did. They blocked any attempts to force him to testify, and perhaps even more inexcusably, the media also refused to put any pressure on Kissinger either. Instead, they continually brought him on TV news to act as an expert rather than a criminal suspect.
And now, at age 75,
I brought you a dress.
one of his favorite things to do is play with his grandchildren.
So he got away with it, and for that he represents a perfect symbol of elite impunity, and the moral depravity of a Washington foreign policy establishment and media that was willing to glad hand him. Or at least, that's what I thought. But then he died.
Henry Kissinger, America's most consequential and controversial Secretary of State, died last night at the age of 100.
And a weird thing happened. Almost no one came to his defense.
Manipulative and insecure. Some called him a war criminal for his role in bombing Cambodia.
Respected by many, reviled by many.
Kissinger was reviled by many, accused of directing U.S. policies that ignored or even tacitly approved murders and massacres.
And White House tapes reveal that Kissinger sometimes enabled the worst in Nixon.
Apparently the establishment that never had trouble kissing up to him when he was alive suddenly had trouble saying nice things about him once he was no longer useful. His less sympathetic obituaries called him a war criminal, and his more sympathetic obituaries called him a war criminal, in scare quotes. Politico had a panel of experts to talk about his legacy, and they were all scathing. This in turn caught Kissinger's would-be critics off guard. If you read the really venomous obituaries of Kissinger, they make references to the fawning obituaries in the mainstream media, but they don't hyperlink to any because they couldn't find any. In fact, to find genuine mourning of Kissinger, one had, ironically, to turn to non-Americans, like insane Scottish neoconservative Neil Ferguson.
And the overthrow of Allende was fundamentally, and this is clear from the Chilean documents, a Chilean affair driven by profound dissatisfaction with the economic disaster that Allende was causing. And so that's just one example of the kind of complexity of the Cold War. And we have to ask ourselves, would it have been better just to leave the Allende government to carry on down the path of economic disaster that it had embarked on?
But ironically, America's rivals were the most effusive. Dmitry Medvedev and Xi Jinping had far more nice things to say about the man than Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, which, is weird for a supposed avatar of American imperialism. So if the establishment didn't really think that highly of Kissinger, why did it seem that way? The answer, it turns out, is that Henry Kissinger worked really hard at it. By the early 80s, Kissinger had actually lost most of his influence in Washington circles. Both Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan saw Kissinger as the embodiment of everything wrong with the foreign policy establishment, and for 12 years the President of the United States was either Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan. So he moved to New York City to get away from Washington that didn't really want much to do with him anymore. But New York allowed him to leverage power in a different way. His real influence was waning, but by moving to New York he could still use his celebrity to gain other kinds of connections. Mainly connections to apolitical celebrities like actors and fashion designers who didn't know or care about foreign policy, and so would have no issues hanging out with an accused war criminal. It also gave him much better access to television, since many nightly news broadcasts don't film in Washington, they film in Manhattan.
I want to talk to you about your book, Crisis. I've been reading it. I'm just kidding.
And your new book is called On China.
Right.
What's it about?
If you live anywhere between Egypt, Pennsylvania, and Lebanon, New Hampshire, I foresee more peaceful weather for you.
Booking agents are much more likely to call you when they know your office is only 2 blocks away from the studio. But Kissinger's own machinations are only half the story. Kissinger's critics also played a role in keeping Kissinger relevant. In a sense, by convincing the world that Henry Kissinger was a sociopath, it bolstered his reputation as the guy who could best give hard-nosed, realist opinion on what was going on in the world. To the point that his name became synonymous with realpolitik, even though he wasn't really a practitioner of it any more than any other Secretary of State. And in a media environment where every news bureau is first and foremost obsessed with avoiding accusations of bias, particularly left-wing bias, Who could be more unbiased than a man who has absolutely no moral values whatsoever?
Certainly the first phase of the campaign was, in my view, too hesitant and more concerned with avoiding casualties than with achieving results.
But there was also a more utilitarian reason people kept turning to Kissinger for advice.
The noise of gunfire rose from all over the center of Peking. It was unremitting.
The troops have been firing indiscriminately, but still, there are thousands of people on the streets who will not move back.
In 1989, Kissinger made a splash by defending the Chinese government after the June 4th massacre.
Henry Kissinger. He wrote a column saying China remains too important for America's national security to risk the relationship on the emotions of the moment.
And I think it's outrageous to imply that my views would be influenced by economic considerations.
Kissinger's consulting firm advises companies doing business with China.
This didn't do much for his reputation in America, but in China it opened doors for him that were open to no other Americans. Doors that would get more and more lucrative as China grew more powerful in the 2000s. So he could leverage his access to the Chinese government into access to the White House, even getting meetings with presidents who didn't actually think that highly of him. But what really brought Kissinger back into respectability in policymaking circles was the war on terror.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
Not as a champion of it, but amazingly as a critic of it. Now, Henry Kissinger publicly supported almost all of George Bush's moves during his first term, and he only started publicly criticizing the Iraq War when the war became unpopular. But while he did that, someone was always making sure there were rumors reported in the newspapers that behind the scenes, Kissinger was counseling caution. Plus, because Iraq had allegedly been an idealistic war to spread democracy, people projected their opposition onto Kissinger, since he, after all, was the realist. This meant Kissinger and his approach to foreign policy suddenly seemed moderate compared to the neoconservatives. For the Democrats, this was especially useful because in the mid-2000s, they were still vulnerable to accusations that they were too anti-war. So it was useful to say, look, even the bloodthirsty Henry Kissinger agrees with us. We're not dirty hippies.
I'm glad that Senator McCain brought up the history, the bipartisan history, of us engaging in direct diplomacy. Senator McCain mentioned Henry Kissinger, who's one of his advisors, who, along with 5 recent secretaries of state, just said that we should meet with Iran, guess what, without precondition. This is one of your own advisors.
Dr. Kissinger did not say that he would approve of face-to-face meetings between the President of the United States and the President Ahmadinejad. He did not say that.
Of course not. When we talk about preconditions, and Henry Kissinger did say we should have contacts without preconditions. Yeah.
Oh, please.
No,
by the way, my friend Dr. Kissinger, who's been my friend for 35 years, would be interested to hear this conversation and Senator Obama's depiction of his positions on the issue. I've known him for 35 years.
We're going to go to a new lead.
Senator Obama is parsing words.
So by 2008, you had candidates from both parties fighting over who Henry Kissinger agreed with more. And this brings us to the real reason why, in the few years before he died, it suddenly became fashionable again to get performatively angry at Henry Kissinger.
She talked about getting the approval or the support or the mentoring of Henry Kissinger. Now, I find it rather amazing because I happen to believe that Henry Kissinger was one of the most destructive secretaries of state in the modern history of this country. I am proud to say that Henry Kissinger is not my friend.
All contemporary political discussion is in some way a relitigation of the 2016 Democratic Party presidential primary, and Kissinger discourse is no exception.
Count me in as somebody who will not be listening to Henry Kissinger.
Well, I know journalists have asked who you do listen to on foreign policy, and we have yet to know who that is.
Well, it ain't Henry Kissinger, that's for sure.
This moment really perfectly encapsulates everything wrong with Clinton's campaign. She ran the perfect campaign to win an election in 2004. But by 2016, the world had changed. The danger was in appearing too pro-war, not too anti-war. But there's one last reason that I think the people who work in American foreign policy find themselves drawn to Henry Kissinger. But to explain it, we have to look at what happened after Kissinger left office.
The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner, and according to a student spokesman, will be held as hostages until the deposed Shah is returned from the United States.
In 1979, supporters of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran seized the American embassy in Tehran and held the staff hostage for over a year.
Kissinger meets privately with Secretary Vance and also talks to the president. In each case, his message is, a man who for 37 years was a friend of the United States should not be treated like a Flying Dutchman who cannot find a port of call.
This wasn't the worst hostage crisis in American history, but this crisis ended up being an important first in a different way.
This is an ABC News special. The Iran Crisis. America Held Hostage.
4 days into the crisis, the ABC network launched America Held Hostage, a 30-minute news report on the hostages. The show was a huge hit despite running at 11:30 p.m., so they ran it again.
Here in Washington, there is a growing sense of helplessness as well as outrage.
And again.
Look at this. One American, blindfolded, handcuffed.
And again.
The Swedish ambassador went to see them today, along with diplomats from France, Algeria, and Syria. It was a mercy mission, they said, to see how the prisoners were being treated.
And soon it became a daily show.
Day 142 of the Iran hostage crisis.
Day 314 of the hostage crisis in Iran. Impasse, stalemate, deadlock. That sums up the hostage crisis tonight after 416 days.
The coverage all seemed decidedly slanted to make the audience at home feel as personally humiliated by the matter as possible. The hostage crisis destroyed Carter.
And another big one fallen to Reagan, Michigan. Michigan has gone to Reagan. Ohio and Michigan now in the Middle West, both for Reagan. It really leaves Jimmy Carter almost nowhere to go.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you. So I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt.
So when Reagan replaced him, his team came in with a plan to never let themselves get taken for a ride by the media. But this would be a huge problem for Reagan's new Secretary of State.
Since H.R. Haldeman left the White House, the man working closest to the president has been Alexander Haig.
General Alexander Haig was Henry Kissinger's second-in-command during the Vietnam War, and quickly ended up as his most trusted advisor. And after 12 long years of climbing and scraping, he finally overtook Kissinger to get the top job for himself, his dream job. He was Secretary of State, the most powerful foreign policy job in the country. He quit after a year. He hated it. Haig had assumed that having gotten Kissinger's job, he could work like Kissinger, but in the Reagan White House, every action was run through a public opinion measuring process. Every person in the cabinet was using private connections with the media to put pressure on their coworkers. Every memo leaked to the press a few days after it was written. No one was coordinating with each other. No one was allowed to coordinate. Everyone ended up having to dance to the tune of the cable news drum. It wasn't that taking care of the press hadn't been part of foreign policy before. What was new was the volume. Before, a White House could identify something the American people want and concoct a strategy to achieve it in the coming year or two. But now, no one had the patience to wait for years, and every tactical detail of every strategy was the subject of ruthless scrutiny. If a single move or statement looked bad out of context, it would have to be nixed, even if it made sense as part of a bigger scheme. So, grand strategy just had to be abandoned. There is simply no place in the world for a capital G great man that bends foreign policy to his will, like Bismarck or Metternich. Kissinger was the last. That was the real source of his mystique. Evil or not, he was the last link to a world before diplomacy was replaced by political pandering, focus group spectacle, and poll watching. Today's generation of foreign policy makers see in him what they dreamed they could be, even if he was a monstrous shitheel. But the truth about Henry Kissinger is that even his central role as America's foreign policy Grey Cardinal in those years is primarily a product of his reputation management, both the achievements and the crimes. Between the publishing of all these books and now, a lot of documents have been declassified, and the story they tell is similar but not exactly the same as the one you can read in Price of Power or The Trials of Henry Kissinger. Take Cambodia. Kissinger is singled out as the architect of the bombing, and that's true for the first few weeks when it was still a limited border incursion. But after it was no longer secret, Nixon simply started giving his orders directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The real architect of the escalation of the bombing that killed so many people and laid the groundwork for the Khmer Rouge was Creighton Abrams. Ironically, the one man who came out of the war with his reputation intact. Similarly, in the transcript of the conversation where Suharto is given permission to invade Timor-Leste, it's President Ford who volunteered his support first, not Kissinger. The trip to China was Nixon's idea, not Kissinger's, and while Kissinger did lots of the critical legwork, he never really tried to hammer out a normalization agreement. Nixon ultimately just ended up having a fun dinner party with Zhou Enlai. The actual hard and thankless work of hammering out an agreement fell to Cyrus Vance and Jimmy Carter. Kissinger's reputation as a grand strategist came mostly from the weakness of the competition. Remember, the only Republican Secretary of State before Nixon became president was John Foster Dulles. And frankly, a golden retriever in a bow tie would look like a master diplomat compared to John Foster Dulles. When it comes to foreign policy hands, Brzezinski was a better Cold War grand strategist by far, and Jim Baker was a better negotiator by far. And while Hitchens' idea of throwing Kissinger to The Hague as a sort of blood sacrifice to the would-be international order might have been a good idea, that ship sailed with the Iraq War. The truth about Kissinger is that he allowed, even encouraged people to portray him as a monster as a means of bolstering his image as a great man. The truth is, we all fell for it, and he got the last laugh. Dracula, Partnior, Stretch, Hopsan, Kian Hammer, Alex the Social Choice and Voting Theory Nerd, Bobby G, Bear River Vaquera, Equilibrium Television, Archer's Bloody Mary, Laser Pig, Learned, Ultra Black, Admiral A, Finn Bortle, Public Loser, Goblin Stack, Lumberjacques Cousteau, Deadass Reagan, Arjun von Dahlen, Hisner, Professor Giraffenstein, Creation Scientist, Stylish Hobo, Calvin Garbitzik, Alexander Schmidt, Darth Mozart, Greg Hildner, Ethan Jackson, Clawforce, Ian Woods, Robert Falla, Owen O'Neill, Subphoenix La La La, Daniel B, Dmitry Ponomarenko, Nick T, Arctic Sea, Travis Bennett Video, Pablo Gonzalez, Patrick Bender, ODST Shax, Auto Expert, Uncomfy, Rasmus Hansen, Nathan C. Tupper, Revengeance Musical, Chop Macabre, Glenn Ara, Jack Bragi, Christoph Kaczynski, Love Letters, Daniel Frey, Metatron, Jennifer McCanna, Gary Oakes Girth, Peyton Miller, Matthias Hoop, Sophastrum, Anthony Gincola, Strelic 23, Christopher DeClerc, Alex Zabara, Goon, Enrico Migliorini, Deadmoo 53, Alexi, Rosie the Cat, Vault Breaker, Tired and Emotional, Cop Creature Shop, Dr. Majalis, Texture, Jacob Thompson, Display GFX, Vicantus Glodinus, Sarah the Crocsune, Chris Hanshu, Beyond, Derek, Gabriel Deards, Jerry Makovsky, 123456789, Peanut Supreme, John Miller, Yang Wei Feng, Game Warrior 010, Totally Useless, Connor Barber, Dustin Walkwood, Heartman, James Lynch, Cullen, Bernth, Aki665, Balin Kovac, Old Drippy, Ananas, Taboon, Zoobeers, Watch the Anime Cat Planet Cuties, Null, Alan Wake, That's Good Broth, Arianai, Red Rex, Garpenlov, Armin Hindenburg, Telex V, Carl Neo, B. Quinn, Sir S, Sean Oscar, Fold Out Chair, Joel Gomez, Gabo Tsai, Scott Beckett, Zach Christensen, Horse Course, Knowing Better, Nate Rice, Tedsville, The Goddess of My Idolatry, Kimma, Spoderman, Aaron, Fogkiten, Jacob Lisi, Big Nove, Elia, Diana Banana, and last but not least, Kitten of the Yarn Persuasion.